Good day, everyone. Here is a story coming from the channel of Elite Story. And I would like to impart to you the lessons learned from this. Our president visited the almost forgotten heroes that served the government of the United States of America. Here is the video.
It was past midnight when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the military hospital. The staff inside barely noticed at first, assuming it was another government official making rounds. But when President Donald Trump stepped out, flanked by Secret Service agents, whispers spread like wildfire. Unlike his usual public appearances, this visit had no media coverage, no cameras, no staged handshakes. The nurses exchanged surprised glances, wondering why he was here in the dead of night. Trump adjusted his suit and walked inside with quiet determination. The hospital's head doctor, Dr. Reynolds, rushed forward, unsure of how to address the situation, but Trump raised a hand. "I'm not here for politics," he said. "Take me to the soldiers." The hallways of the hospital were eerily silent, save for the occasional beep of heart monitors and the shuffling of nurses making their rounds. The military hospital housed soldiers who had given everything for their country. Some bore scars, others had lost limbs, and many suffered in silence. Trump walked past rows of beds, his eyes scanning the faces of men and women who had once stood on the front lines. A young nurse, Emily, watched cautiously. She had seen politicians visit before, posing for pictures, shaking hands, making promises. But something about Trump's presence felt different. He wasn't accompanied by a swarm of advisors, nor was he giving a rehearsed speech. Instead, he seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Trump stopped at one bed, his gaze settling on a young man staring blankly at the ceiling. His nameplate read, Private James Carter. A double amputee, James had lost both legs in combat, and with them, his hope for the future. His fiancée had left him, friends had stopped visiting, and he felt abandoned by the world. When he noticed Trump standing beside him, he sighed. "You don't have to pretend you care," James muttered. But instead of leaving, Trump pulled up a chair. "Tell me your story," he said. James hesitated, but something in Trump's tone, something real, made him open up. For the first time in months, he spoke about his pain, his fears, and the loneliness that haunted him. James talked about the moment his life changed forever, the explosion that took his legs and nearly took his life. He spoke of the nightmares, the phantom pains, and the feeling of being discarded by the world. Trump listened intently, not interrupting once. "Do you feel like your service meant nothing?" Trump finally asked. James clenched his jaw. "Sometimes, yeah." Trump exhaled, his expression heavy with something close to regret. "That's a damn shame," he said. "Because you're a hero, and this country should never forget that." For the first time, James felt truly seen. Trump patted his shoulder and promised him, "You're not alone. I won't let you be." James wasn't sure if he believed him, until later. Emily, the young nurse, had been watching the interaction from a distance. Her heart ached for James. She had seen him at his lowest, refusing visitors, turning away from life itself. She approached cautiously. "Mr. President," she said, "there are others like James, soldiers who have no family, no one to remind them they matter." Trump turned to her, his eyes sharp yet understanding. "Then show me," he said without hesitation. Emily led him deeper into the ward, past beds filled with wounded soldiers, some too weak to speak. But one door stood out, the door to room 207. "He hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks," Emily said softly. "He lost more than just his health." Trump nodded. "Let's see him." Room 207 was dimly lit, with a single window showing the night sky. Inside, an older veteran, Sergeant William Reynolds, sat in a wheelchair, staring out as if waiting for something, or someone, that would never come. Trump stepped inside, and William barely glanced his way. "Another visitor come to pity me?" he muttered. Trump sat down, folding his hands. "No pity, just respect." William turned, raising an eyebrow. "Respect? For what? For being too broken to serve?" His voice was bitter. Trump shook his head. "For giving everything you had. For raising a son who followed in your footsteps." At that, William froze. His son had died in combat. His name barely mentioned in the news. "How do you know?" he whispered. William's hands trembled as he spoke of his son, Lieutenant Jason Reynolds. Jason had saved his entire unit, sacrificing himself in the process. "They called him a hero for a day," William said bitterly. "Then they forgot." Trump leaned forward. "I won't forget." William scoffed, but there was something about the way Trump said it. Firm, unwavering. "His name will be honored," Trump promised. "I'll make sure of it." William's hardened expression finally cracked, his eyes glistening. He had spent years drowning in grief, convinced his son's sacrifice had been lost to time. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone still cared enough to remember. Trump turned to the hospital staff. "I need a list," he said. "Every fallen soldier whose family is struggling. Every veteran who's been forgotten." The staff hesitated. This wasn't the kind of request they were used to from politicians. But there was no denying the sincerity in his voice. One doctor, hesitant but moved, spoke up. "We can do that, Mr. President," Trump nodded. "Then let's get to work." That night, he didn't just shake hands and leave. He sat down with doctors, listened to nurses, and wrote names down himself. He made phone calls, arranged meetings, and started the wheels of real change. For once, the soldiers weren't just names in a file. They were stories worth remembering. As Trump exited the ward, he noticed a small boy sitting on a bench in the hallway, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. His big, tired eyes locked onto Trump with a mix of curiosity and sadness. Trump stopped and knelt to his level. "What's your name, champ?" he asked. The boy hesitated before mumbling, "Michael." His mother, standing nearby with red, swollen eyes, stepped forward. "His father, Captain Rodriguez, is in critical condition. We don't know if he'll make it." Trump glanced at the closed ICU door. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your dad's a fighter," he said, "and fighters don't give up." Michael clutched his teddy bear tighter, wanting to believe it but too afraid to hope. Trump entered the dimly lit ICU, where Captain Rodriguez lay motionless, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily. The man looked fragile, barely clinging to life. Trump pulled up a chair and leaned in, speaking softly. "Your son is waiting for you." He paused, glancing at the tired soldier. "You've given everything for this country. It's time we give something back." The room was silent except for the steady heartbeat on the monitor. As if hearing the words, Captain Rodriguez's eyelids fluttered. A single tear slipped down his cheek. A nurse gasped. He hadn't shown movement in days. Trump patted his hand and whispered, "Hang in there." That night, against all odds, Rodriguez's condition began to stabilize. Before leaving, Trump handed Michael's mother a sealed envelope. "Open this when you're ready," he said. Confused, she clutched it, watching as he walked away. Hours later, when she finally unfolded the letter, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a formal document. It was a personal, handwritten note from Trump. It spoke of gratitude for her husband's service, encouragement for Michael's future, and a promise, a full scholarship for Michael's education. Alongside the note was a signed order for financial support for struggling military families. Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't just a letter. It was hope, a lifeline in their darkest hour. The hospital visit left Trump deep in thought as he returned to the White House. That very night, instead of resting, he made calls. He spoke with lawmakers, advisors, and military officials, drafting new initiatives for veterans, better health care, mental health resources, and full scholarships for children of fallen soldiers. The next morning, his staff was stunned by his urgency. "We need action," Trump declared, holding up the papers. "These men and women gave everything. Now it's our turn." His team scrambled to put things in motion. Meanwhile, word of his hospital visit quietly spread among the military community, even though there was no official press coverage. The soldiers had seen something real that night, something that couldn't be faked. Days passed, and the impact of Trump's visit became evident. Soldiers at the hospital, once feeling forgotten, found themselves receiving unexpected calls from support organizations. Veterans who had struggled for years suddenly received assistance. But Trump refused to turn it into a political spectacle. When asked by reporters about military funding changes, he simply said, "It's the right thing to do." Emily, the nurse, couldn't believe it. She had expected the visit to be a brief moment, just another appearance. But now she saw real changes happening. "He actually meant what he said," she whispered to a colleague. And for the first time in a long time, hope spread through the halls of the hospital. Late at night, Trump sat alone in the Oval Office, staring at a photograph he had been given at the hospital. Sergeant William Reynolds' son, Jason, in uniform. He traced the edges of the picture, deep in thought. Jason had been a hero, and yet few knew his name. Trump opened his desk drawer, where he had placed a small stack of names, soldiers whose sacrifices he had learned about during his visit. He whispered under his breath, "I won't forget you." The weight of responsibility bore down on him. For all the political battles he faced daily, this was what truly mattered. And he vowed to carry their stories with him. Months later, Emily found herself drafting a letter she never thought she'd write. She had seen firsthand how one night had changed everything in the hospital. Soldiers who once felt forgotten now had support, hope, and resources they never had before. And all because a president had shown up, not for cameras, not for votes, but simply because he cared. She sealed the envelope and sent it to the White House, not expecting a reply. After all, he was the president. Surely he had more important things to do. But what happened next stunned her. One morning, Emily received an official-looking envelope with the White House seal. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note from Trump himself. "Emily, the real heroes are people like you, the ones who never stop fighting for these soldiers. Thank you for what you do. You inspire more than you know." Enclosed with the note was something even more astonishing. A signed bill improving military hospital conditions nationwide. Her breath caught. This wasn't just words on paper. It was real, tangible change. She clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed. The world might never know the full story of that night at the hospital, but she did. And that was enough. Months later, an unexpected event took place at the White House. A private gathering was held, and veterans from across the country were invited. No media, no political speeches, just a quiet, heartfelt event. Among them was Sergeant William Reynolds, who had struggled with grief for years. As he shook Trump's hand, he whispered, "You kept your promise." Trump nodded solemnly. James Carter, the young soldier who had once given up on life, was also there, now leading a support group for wounded veterans. "I'm alive because of that night," he admitted. Trump simply patted his shoulder. Sometimes the most powerful moments needed no words. James Carter never thought he'd find purpose again. But after that night at the hospital, everything changed. Inspired by Trump's words, he started reaching out to other veterans, forming a support group. What began as a small circle of wounded soldiers sharing their struggles soon grew into something bigger, a national movement helping thousands. News outlets eventually caught on, but James always traced it back to one conversation. "He made me believe I wasn't worthless," he told reporters. "That's why I'm still here." His redemption became a beacon of hope for others, proving that even in the darkest moments, a single act of kindness could change everything. A year later, Trump returned to the military hospital, this time not as a stranger, but as a familiar face. Soldiers who had once been hopeless now sat up with smiles. James, in his wheelchair, was talking to new patients, offering them the same hope he had received. Emily greeted Trump at the entrance, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You did more than visit," she said. "You changed lives." Trump smiled but shook his head. "They changed mine too." As he walked through the halls, he stopped at Captain Rodriguez's room. The soldier, now recovered, saluted him. "I made it," he said. Trump gripped his hand. "I never doubted you." As Trump prepared to leave, Sergeant Williams stood, his cane trembling slightly. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand in a salute. One by one, the other soldiers followed, even those in wheelchairs saluting as best they could. The doctors, the nurses, the staff. Everyone stood in solemn respect. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about power. It was about something deeper: honor, gratitude, and the recognition of sacrifices that could never be repaid. As Trump turned to leave, Emily wiped away a tear. In the quiet hum of the hospital, one thing was clear: no one would ever forget that night.